thank you so much. Thank you for all the panelists. You know, as an interfaith council, one of the things that's so important for us is to provide this platform to have discourse like the one that you're hearing, particularly in today's time and in today's age. And so we're really grateful for the opportunity to do so. And, you know, given that it's been the pandemic, we were concerned in the onset that whether we would be able to continue providing these important programs and resources. And I'm really happy to say that with the help of the community, my board, all of us really, you know, during this pandemic, we have provided more than 35 different programs and sessions that focused on just a litany of issues, from our courageous conversations to our helping the helpers, to programs like this that we've been doing, to our daily inspirations. And so we're really grateful for that opportunity to do that. But like any nonprofit, particularly during this paradigm and during this pandemic, we need your help. And we recognize that a lot of us are in difficult situations financially, and we respect that. But if you are able to help, if there's something that you can contribute towards us so that we can continue these programs, we would be so grateful. And I would like to invite Cheryl to present that slide so we can, and there's 3 ways that you could do that. You know, you could mail in a donation to our address, 759 Linden Avenue in Long Beach. You could text help SAIC to the number 44321, and that will take you to where you can give a donation. Or alternatively, you can go on our website at scinterfaith.org and click the donate button. And you'll see on the website, we have, again, you know, a number of upcoming programs as well. So our goal and our aim is to continue providing programs and services to our community, to the community that we serve. And we thank you, you know, for allowing us and enabling us to do that with your kindness and contributions. And as a way of kind of saying thank you for that, I wanted to also highlight a really special program that we're going to have in October. And Cheryl, if I may ask you to, yes, there we go. You know, last year we had our first annual gala, and it was beautiful, and it was a setting where we all gathered together. And obviously we're not able to do that physically, but at the same time, we really, again, wanted to provide a platform and a space where we can come together, and we can also, you know, celebrate one another and celebrate our faiths and our cultures, and really provide a sense of hope in a time when, you know, let's face it, it's been challenging. And so this is something that we are providing for the whole community to engage in, and we hope that you will join us on October 18th. Yes, it will be done over Zoom, and we're really excited to have actor and comedian, writer, director, and producer Rayne Wilson, who's best known for his role as Dwight Schrute on the NBC sitcom The Office. What many don't know about him is that he's actually a very devout Baha'i. And so a lot of what he does is guided by his principles within the Baha'i faith. So he's going to be with us as well, and just, you know, talk to us about the importance of a community at this time. So we hope that, again, you can go on our website and RSVP. There's no cost for this. We just want to provide a service, you know, an opportunity for all of us to come together and celebrate one another as well. So again, thank you. And I think we're probably getting towards where we will be starting the program again. So thank you all for joining us again, and let's continue.
Okay, thank you, Milia, so much. By the way, I do see the questions in the Q&A, and I've copied and pasted them over. I hope there's some really great questions regarding hate crimes and specific subcommunities and the incarceration of, I think, referring to the criminal justice system and our immigration problems today. So I'm keeping track of those questions, and I hope we can address them towards the end of the program. So thank you all for staying with us today and being here with us. We've talked a little bit about hurtful language and how much it really does matter. What about I obviously look brown, and so sometimes people are curious. They're curious about my background, and they want to know more about me, or might approach one of you. What do you guys think? What is the difference between, or what? There's the question, where are you from? How is this question different and similar to the really ugly phrase we've been hearing nowadays, targeting our AAPI community members, go back to where you come from? Jasmine, can I have you share?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference with the intention. So I've had people ask me like really curiously, what's your ancestry, or where are your parents from? And a lot of the time I'll just answer, but I've also had experiences where people are just like fetishizing and making kind of like gross and inappropriate jokes after. So I think that this just shows that we need to have better education from like kindergarten about how to talk about ethnicity, race, and just that kind of education I think is really missed out on in the public school system, at least.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Can I tell a short story? I was working on a civil rights case in the South a number of years ago. And I went to a restaurant, and a white waitress came up to take my order, and she was taking my order. And then she started staring at me, and she said, well, where are you from? Where's your family from? And I thought about my mother's side of the family, and I said, well, my great-grandfather was a miner in New Mexico, and my grandfather was a tailor in Oakland, and my mother was born in Stockton, California. And she interrupted me without any hesitation. And she said, and how do you like your new country? And I thought, oh, I guess 4 generations isn't quite enough. And so I think there's a difference between, intentions and purposeful attacks against us, and just being non-educated, being ignorant. And so I think there's a process where we have to educate people. It is taxing on Asian Americans, because we have to do it every generation, because I'm sure my sons will be asked the same question during their lifetimes, even though they're the 5th generation. So it is something that we just have to deal with.
It's interesting. I have a friend. She is like me. So her parents immigrated from Pakistan. She was born here. She's married to a young man who recently immigrated from Canada. He immigrated a year ago. So he was born in Canada, but he is white. So if they go out for dinner, people assume she's the immigrant, because they do this, they're newlyweds. So newlyweds have time for cute games. So they'll ask, who's the immigrant? And people will 9.5 times out of 10 say she's the immigrant. And so I think the real question that we need to think about is the implicit bias that is underscoring these questions, right? Jasmine said, yes, there's a difference in intentions, where one question, where are you from, may come from a place of curiosity, whereas a comment like go back where you come from is racist because it's charged with a power differential and it has bad intentions. But they're both coming from this place of bias, that to be American is tied to whiteness, right? And I find it painful at times, because my kids are brown. They have never been to Pakistan. They do not speak Urdu. They know nothing else other than American culture. But it's like a little reminder to them that they'll never be completely American. So did anyone else want to add to that?
I wanted to add something. It's also ironic because like Indigenous people are almost never, like when people see Indigenous people, they don't assume that they're American when they are the OGs.
Yes, yes, of course. Thank you, Jasmine. So while the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has certainly been deeply impacted by racism and at times very unequal government policies at times, if we look at how the immigration from AAPI countries was controlled and discriminated against over many decades, it would be really unfair and iniquitous to not contextualize the AAPI experience amongst a greater landscape of race in America. So I'm hoping we can now connect our conversation today to what is happening in our country. How does the widely varied experience of the AAPI community relate to the experiences of African Americans, Indigenous communities, and the national discourse around race?
So I'll take a shot at that. It's a big question, right? it's a tough one to make. It's not a simple answer to that, of course. But you know, I think just like the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is very diverse and varied. Obviously the experience of each minority group is also very varied. I can never truly understand the experience of African Americans, the Latino, Indigenous communities, because, and I think, speaking of where are you from, each of our origin stories is different. We in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community may have immigrant and refugee stories, but we don't have the same origin of slavery that African Americans have, or violent displacement and betrayal that Native Americans and Latino communities have. And these origin stories really do impact the emotions and experiences that we of each community. Even when we talk about go back to where you came from, that feeling of always being the other. If you think about some of the origin stories, say refugees that were driven out of their Southeast Asia, because of forces that were really not up to them, and then kind of feeling not at home in their country, and coming to the U.S. and then being told when they came here, go back to where you came from. There's that rejection, dual rejection. And so I think that a lot of those things impact, our experiences and the emotions and the deep experiences that we feel of not being accepted or being foreigner. So yeah, there's a lot of differences among the communities. But I think one thing that I feel also is that I think just because there are differences, doesn't mean that we have nothing in common with other minority groups. I think we all seem to share experiences of feeling incredible pressure to conform, assimilate at times. We feel the exhaustion, the weariness from fighting to be heard and seen and valued. A lot of those things are common. And I think those common emotional challenges can really bind us together in a special way, where I think powerful partnerships can be formed. So I think sometimes when people envision multi-ethnic communities, they think of, cross-cultural immediately, like Black and white unity or whatever. But I think some of the power of what I'm seeing right now in this landscape is minority communities that are actually learning to understand each other better, and they're working together for justice. There's actually this crowdsourced letter among the Asian American and Pacific Islander community a number of years ago that was written to help younger minorities explain to their parents and relatives why they support the Black Lives Matter movement. And in it, it says, "We are all fighting against the same unfair system that prefers we compete against each other." And I love that quote, that, we're different, yes, but we have to fight against any forces that might divide us from each other. And so I think there's a lot of connection as well.
Adrian, can I just ask you to read that sentence one more time? Because that was really powerful.
From the letter?
Yeah, the one about powers.
Yeah. We are all fighting against the same unfair system that prefers we compete against each other.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. Does someone else want to add to this one about contextualizing this conversation and experience?
I'd just like to add that I think it's very important for Asian Americans to understand how Black leaders historically have supported Asian Americans. This is not just a recent phenomenon of building unity amongst different people of color. In 1869, I'll just read this briefly, Frederick Douglass was asked, he was giving a speech, and at that time, both the Democratic and Republican parties were very anti-Chinese. And so Frederick Douglass said, what would you do if I would favor such immigration from China? I answer, I would. Would you have them naturalized and have them invested with all the rights of American citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would. I want a home here for not only the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here in the United States and feel at home here, both for his sake and for ours. I just thought that you know, when I've looked at the history of how Black leaders have looked at Asian Americans, they have been very supportive. You have Frederick Douglass, you have different NAACP chapters during World War II condemning the incarceration of Japanese Americans. You have Martin Luther King speaking out for the self-determination of the Vietnamese people. You had people like Langston Hughes and other Black leaders speaking out for the freedom of India. And so I think that we have to draw on this history when we talk about building multiracial unity and strengthen the vision of a multiracial democracy. I think we have to draw on history as well as the current events. Otherwise, we think that we're starting all over again.
Wow, thank you so much for reminding us that a lot of us here today, even myself, as a child of South Asian immigrants, we stand on the shoulders of the African Americans who have been leading this nation for so long. And of course—
one last thing, in 1965, the whole face of Asian Americans in this country changed with the immigration law of 1965, which equalized the immigration patterns. That law was passed because of the civil rights movement. And so for Asian Americans to say, well, what have Blacks or minorities done for me? Most of us wouldn't be here in the United States but for the civil rights movement. So I think it's just a reminder that we have to understand where we came from and what our histories have been. Otherwise, we think we're starting all over again.
Thank you, Stuart. My dad immigrated in 1970 as a 16-year-old, and it was the first man on the moon that inspired him to immigrate, but it was a civil rights movement that allowed him to make that immigration. So thank you so much for showing us the intersectionality and interconnectedness of all of our communities. Thank you so much. That was really powerful. So bias and systemic racism impacts the mindset of all people. Even those of us who are engaged in this work are impacted by bias. We may, myself included, may knowingly or unknowingly express bias and thereby inadvertently fuel racism. Certainly in my community, the South Asian community, there is very strong anti-Black bias, which contributes to systemic racism, even if we are the subjects of racism ourselves. And even if we didn't create the system and we don't feel that we have power. I wanted to ask you guys, is there anti-Black bias within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community? What does it look like, and what do you think the impact of it is? Stuart, and then maybe Melissa can add to it.
Well, I do think that there is an unfortunate tradition of anti-Blackness that I believe comes from immigrants trying to get accepted into the mainstream. And they believe that the mainstream is filled with white supremacist notions of who is superior and who is inferior. But I do think that anti-Blackness can be battled because if we understand our history, being supported by African American and Black leaders, by understanding how we've united with Latino leaders. So for example, Filipino farm workers uniting with Mexican American farm workers to form the powerful UFW. I think that we have to bring that history back. And I think the other thing we have to do is we have to bring it up to date. So for example, 2 weeks ago, we had 12 Asian American groups in Los Angeles come out, and we had a virtual press conference for affirmative action, which was both in our interest and in solidarity with other minorities. The Chinese American Citizens Alliance, the oldest civil rights group in the Chinese community, has united with the Urban League in Los Angeles, and they're actually going to appear before the LA Police Commission in a couple of weeks to demand an end to police brutality. and they have a specific program that they both endorse. So what I'm seeing is that groups are starting to come together. In fact, 3 to 4 Asian American groups have called me in the last 2 months and said, how do we engage with Black and Latino organizations? Because there were a period of years where there was disengagement. Now we're coming together because we're being tested as a nation. The protests have been great. They've been great to remind us about multiracial democracy. But now we have to take a leap. The protests will continue, but we need to take a leap to make the policy changes and the behavioral changes across the board. So now we're all being tested. I think that churches, temples, synagogues can join that by taking positions against the anti-Asian bias and for an end to police brutality against Black people. So I think there's a lot that we could do, both understanding the history, but what we need to do in this current time.
Thank you, Stuart. Melissa, can you share what you've seen in your community as it relates to anti-Black bias, and maybe include how that may have been now impacted by the killing of George Floyd?
Yes, 100% there is absolutely anti-Black bias in the AAPI community, and it stems from our homes. Growing up, I was told and I shared this with all the panelists previously, I was told that I was picked out of the trash can because I was significantly darker than everyone in my family. To me, I really actually didn't know what that meant until I had pieced everything together in the context of Black lives and the movement now. At over 30 years old, I told my parents just a couple weeks ago, during the time of George Floyd's horrendous murder, that their joke about me being picked out of a trash can was harmful. And my dad responded that, we love you, and it's just a joke. I had never verbalized to him or my parents that this was really harmful. And luckily for me, I did not take it in a way that would harm me myself. So now, like to Stuart's point, I feel like we're seeing a dialogue within the API communities now regarding anti-Blackness and coming together, unfolding all the layers of ourselves in the context of what it means today. It's a tough conversation. But with how the generations now are realizing the harm of anti-Blackness and colorism, it can be hopeful, but it needs to be untaught with our future children. And so we definitely need to extend this conversation even further past where we are now.
Thank you, Melissa. Jasmine, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think what I realized is a lot of the time these countries in Asia, they oftentimes don't have a majority, even a minority of Black folks. So as a result, their perception of Black people is oftentimes from Hollywood. And I think that's why we really have to continue to push for accurate and non-biased representation in media.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was a really important point. Now, notably, I think all of us can agree on watching that video of George Floyd's killing was really painful. In fact, for me, it evoked very similar pain and grief as when I watched the video of the towers being struck. I actually just made that connection right now as I was listening. I feel the same way for some reason when you see the police officer crushing George's throat. And what really was striking in addition in that video is that one of the police officers involved in the killing is identified as a Hmong American, which is one of the many groups within the AAPI community. What does this mean in terms of the complexity of the relationships between the AAPI community, the African American community, and law enforcement? Melissa, as a city council member, as a city leader, what would you have liked to see happen in that video? What should have happened there?
That is so, number one, it should have never happened. You know, I cannot personally, I cannot unsee the video and his horrific death. I cannot see his face and the faces of those cops who killed him. You know, a fake $20 bill is not a death sentence. And I've said that on my dais. Our country's had enough and does not want to be silenced anymore, because we are seeing these protests and everyone who is speaking up, you know, collectively. We protested because our nation will not tolerate this racism and the inequities that the Black community has faced for over 400 years. And those who are oppressed should not have to seek the validation of their oppressors. And then there are individuals who are mad about this movement, and we very well know that they exist. So what I tell them is that they should be happy that they don't have a movement. All lives will matter when Black lives matter. There is no justice for all until there is justice for Black lives. And that's what I have always said. I will continue to say, and I'm not afraid to say it as an elected official. There are many elected officials who won't say it. And that is just a shame. And for me, it's been so hard trying to see how I can govern during this time, because, you know, number one issue in our communities is public safety. But what does that mean in this context? You know, there's the issue of defunding the police, and literally there are elected officials who think defunding the police is taking away the public safety aspect for our communities, when it's not. You know, just understanding what these terms mean, what the BLM movement means, is important. And I've been on this education and listening tour since this movement, because I will only know how to govern unless I'm listening to people. And, you know, thankfully for my city, we've implemented already programs before to help with our communities in need. So we've essentially been defunding the police in this essence. But I really call upon all my elected leaders and API leaders to stand with this movement and understand why people are demanding these things. And it's sad that I haven't seen enough from people who sit at the dais just like me.
Melissa, could you define for us that term? Because when some people, when they hear defund the police, they think we're going to have lawlessness and there won't be any, you know, order to society. What does it mean to defund the police?
It's reallocating funds to housing. It's reallocating funds to our social programs. You know, for me, in my city, we've already reallocated funds to our communities that don't have equal access to, like, even computers. You know, those are the things that we are focused on to make sure that everyone has, like I've said earlier, equal access. You know, everyone should be at the same playing field and access to opportunity. So I really hope that when electeds think about this issue of defunding the police, that they really actually understand what it means.
So I think what you're really talking about is reimagining what a healthy community could look like. For example, one of the common reasons someone will call the police is if there's someone who is homeless or housing impaired outside of their place of business or their home. It's interesting that you would call the police instead of calling social services, right? That person may not pose most likely does not pose a physical threat to me. That person needs some sort of support. But it's interesting that we've gotten used to thinking about people as criminals, and you know, the militarization of our communities has become commonplace. We're used to it now. So thank you, Melissa, for standing up so boldly. And I know it's not easy. I can hear in your voice how challenging it is. It's not easy, and we really appreciate you for listening. And I think you're right. We all need to do that. We especially need to be listening to our African American community members.
Can I add one thing there real quick?
Sure.
Because it's interesting that you brought up the issue of, you know, contacting the police when something happens. Because I had been an outspoken elected official, some people may know because I actually put it on social media, but at that time, I don't know. I personally don't define it as a hate crime towards me, but others actually were trying to convince me it was. I was left a dead cat on my front porch during the time when I was being very outspoken. And what I didn't know exactly what to do. And I was like, in this moment, like, do I call my own sheriffs? You know, like, and I felt so odd, like having to do that. But at the same time, there's the mechanics that you should, you know, maybe it's happening somewhere else. So I did, but I didn't pursue it as a hate crime, even though everyone in the community was saying it. I think it is Melissa. So I just wanted to share that. Even when you speak out, you're targeted.
I'm so sorry that happened to you. And as Stuart mentioned, yes, it's important for us to track these. Following the murder of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Muhammad Yassin, George Floyd, and many others, and the resulting protests, have you seen examples of meaningful allyship between the AAPI community and the African American community? And I think, Stuart, you touched upon this a little bit more. Did you want to add on that?
Well, I think that, you know, the question is, what do we do now? Of course, we could go down to the local protests. One of my sons goes regularly to the protests. But what do you do now to actually get the changes? So I think that groups need to, and individuals need to link together. They need to show what allyship means. And so having groups come together to talk about healing, but also what actions they could take together to stop police brutality or to stop anti-Asian violence, whatever you can dream of. I think that's the key thing, is how do you start linking together? And so, as I was saying, the Chinese American Citizens Alliance called me and wanted to engage with Black groups. So I connected them with the LA Urban League. So they talk every Wednesday morning, and they are talking about how to take action against the violence, how to take action against police brutality, how to fight for affirmative action. So they've actually come together on a very serious agenda of joint work. And so I think that's what, you know, whether it's a synagogue or temple or faith group, that's what we have to start thinking about. What are those connections that can actually advocate for change? Because that's the next step. How do we take the leap to change policy, to change behavior in a broader scale way? I think it's very exciting, because I think the interest is there, but now we have to follow it up with actual deeds.
Thank you, Stuart. Adrian, did you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, just going off what Stuart was saying, you know, and I think there's a lot of ways to make change. You know, I think that we've talked about policy, but, you know, Jasmine represented the school environment, you know, but there, I don't know all the people who are attending today, what line of work you're in or how you're engaged in the community, but there's many ways to do it wherever you're at. For me, my work is in diversity consulting. So working with companies and organizations that are looking to figure out how do we change, you know, in our policies and our structures. And so a lot of them are wondering what to do in this time. And so I'm working with them. So there's a lot of different levels in which this can happen. And one thing that, just a personal example in that area, I'm finding just a lot more partnerships with those in the African-American community as I'm doing this. So a few weeks ago, I was working with an African-American man who reached out to me, and he's in a part of the country where there's a lot of tension between the Black and white communities, you know, with all these murders and killings and whatnot. And he specifically actually told me, I wanted to reach out to you also because you're Asian, and so you understand the pain and the challenge of being a minority, but you can also say certain things that I can't say because you're not Black or white. And I thought that was really interesting. He saw someone from the Asian American and Pacific Islander community as kind of an ambassador, like a bridge builder, a connector. And it made me think, like, how can we be that for other minority communities? And conversely, how can we bring in African American leaders and leaders from other minority groups into our community for wisdom and perspective. So I think it's just something that made me think that in this time, there's a lot of things that can be done across these minority communities to help each other, to provide perspective.
And I really appreciate you guys kind of have outlined some steps. Melissa mentioned that listening is really important right now. And this is the time to really go out of our way to listen to what our African American and Indigenous community members are telling us. And then what Stuart and Adrian are talking about is then being brave enough to reach across our identities and to ally and to network amongst ourselves between communities. That can be very powerful.
Can I add something,
Yes.
Sarah? So on May 11th and 12th, there was a 5-hour documentary on Asian Americans on PBS. I helped the production group raise $2.5 million out of the $5.5 million that they raised for the show. There were about 7 million people who saw that show on the 2 nights. At the same time, my wife and I were asked by PBS to develop a curriculum based on the 5-hour show. And we're just finishing the 36 lesson plans this weekend, literally. And so this is going to be part of the drive for ethnic studies, Black studies, Latinx studies, American Indian studies, and Asian American studies. So I think that's another thing that we could do together, is promote for the long term the education of our students by getting this curriculum in all the schools. California has a proposal to start with the Cal States, but within 2 to 3 years, it will be a requirement in all the high schools. So I think that is another long-term solution. We were talking about how do we educate the people who are basically ignorant. And I think the curriculum is a wonderful way to do that.
Thank you, Stuart. I want to now, I'm going to invite each one of you to share a closing reflection with us. And before I do that, I really want to thank all 4 of you, Stuart, Jasmine, Melissa, and Adrian, for all the time and the sincerity and the willingness to share from your own experiences in life, because it can be very difficult and painful at times. Thank you, Milia, Cheryl, for making this possible, as the staff at the South Coast Interfaith Council and the board, who, when this program was pitched to them, was immediately supportive and felt like this was an important conversation to have. So thank you all. I also, with minority experience, he was actually involved in the initial design, and I don't know, he's moving cross countries and he's been on so many, I'm like, we've Zoomed while he's in a hotel room, driving cross country. I really appreciate all of your time and hard work. Truly, all 4 of our panelists here today are lights in our world, inspiring and empowering each of us to take agency of our bodies and our voices in the struggle for justice, compassion, and equity for all. So thank you so much for sharing your time, expertise, and hearts with us. As we conclude the panel portion of our program, I would like to invite each of you to share a reflection with our audience. As people of faith and conscience, where do we go from this place of brokenness, pain, and discord between communities? What can we do as individuals and communities? Is there someone who'd like to share first?
I can go.
Okay.
Yeah, I think historically, growing up, I always thought that change was top down, but in reality, a lot of the time it's bottom up. So I think we all have a role in this movement, whether it's a church leader, whether it's working at a tech company, whether it's a student or like civil rights leader. I think we all have to really figure out what our roles are and then continue to, you know, like activism and allyship is not convenient or easy. So I think we just have to, you know, keep going with it. And I think also, like, for me personally, I'm out of Gen Z because I think Gen Z has overall been adamant about not working for companies or supporting organizations that are problematic or that are, you know, scammers or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I just want to add, by the way, right after everyone gives us their closing reflection, I'm going to pull some of the questions and offer them to the panelists to answer. Thank you, Jasmine. Adrian, can I invite you next?
Sure. Well, I guess in closing, there's the question about the Hmong American police officer and, some of the pain of seeing his actions or inactions in some people's minds. And earlier I spoke about how in the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, some of us were taught or conditioned to not rock the boat, not make waves. And I think for every culture and group, what I've come to reflect is that there are behaviors like this that we can default to when we're in crisis for self-preservation. But in this critical time, I really believe that more is required for us as leaders, and for those of us who are faith leaders, more than just self-preservation. And I think we're called to be advocates, defenders of other people, and not just be about self-preservation. There's definitely this history among the Asian cultures of insularity. I think some of us are familiar with that. The instinct is to shield ourselves from danger or harm. I can understand where that comes from. But my hope for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community is that we wouldn't just shield ourselves, but that we would be a shield for others in pain, and that we would seek to defend the honor of the people who are most vulnerable right now. And I know that spirit is within our communities, and we have so many strengths and gifts to help us do this. And finally, as a person of faith, I believe that faith begins with humility, to accept that we can't do it on our own, that we don't have all the answers, to recognize that what we have been trying to do is just not working. And so I think faith begins with this humility to accept that we need help from outside ourselves, which to me is God. And I think right now there's not enough humility in these spaces of racial dialogue. That's my reflection. There's not enough listening, as Melissa was talking about, that we need. There's no shortage of people out there who have strong opinions, who are sharing those opinions, no shortage of articles and knowledge out there. But, the Bible says that if we have all the knowledge in the world, but we don't have love, it means nothing. And so instead of more of that, I think what I would like to see is us providing gifts of humility and listening, go on a listening tour, like Melissa said. And most importantly of all, to show love to people through patience, gentleness, and generosity. And when we can't find it in ourselves to do these things, my prayer is that we would look beyond ourselves, because I do believe that's where God and faith are waiting and have always been waiting.
Thank you, Adrian. Melissa, can I please invite you next?
Sure. Thank you so much again for having me. And it's, again, quite an honor to be on this panel with all of you. Stuart talked about the coming up together, like our Black community leaders, joining API leaders, and Latinx as well. From the political lens, it's a little bit hard for me, because I also see that, I've been a government staffer for like almost 20 years. And we have a history of being coalition builders and reaching out to these other communities. But what I've also been seeing, and this might not be favorable, is that it's not reciprocated from the other communities too. And I've actually seen that even right now with when we talk about affirmative action, when our communities don't have the same viewpoint on issues, then we are casted aside. But then yet we still want to reach out to the other communities. So I really don't know how we fix that. And maybe it's like what Stuart has talked about, that we reach out to the other communities and we say we have to have these conversations. But it's been hard, because I've even seen racism from the other communities against us because they were mad about the affirmative action issue. And that was just literally like several weeks ago. But, we're in this space of everyone who has the same mindset, which is good, but we definitely need to take a deeper dive in what it means in the other lens of other people. So I'll continue to still listen, and what I did today was, my next meeting is just to listen and be a messenger and advocate, because I feel like that's what I was set to do. And so thank you so much again. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Malia. It's been an honor.
Thank you, Melissa, for bringing that humility that we're talking about and for being willing to listen. Thank you. Stuart, can I please invite you next?
Well, thank you, Sarah, for organizing us and moderating. You've done a great job. And it's been an honor getting to know Melissa better, and Adrian and Jasmine. I remember way back when we were helping Mrs. Chin, Vincent Chin's mother, try to fight for justice for her son. And she came to Los Angeles and she was speaking at a crowded Chinatown restaurant one afternoon and she fainted. And I remember I was the moderator and I helped her to her feet. And later that evening, I asked her, Lily, are you okay? And she said, Stuart, there's nothing I can do to bring back Vincent, but I don't want any other mother to go through what I've gone through. And I think that's what we all need to internalize, that there are a lot of mothers and fathers who now have lost their child. They have lost their sons. They have lost their daughters. And that urgency to do something, to be helpful, to engage, I think is just so present in this period of time that we need to think, how is it that we're going to help those mothers and fathers not to lose a loved one? And that to me is what we all need to internalize. So thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you to each and every one of you. We have some really great questions here. I'm going to try to pick out the ones that I think will be most meaningful to the greater number of people, and some of them kind of overlap. For anyone who feels like their question was very specific and doesn't get answered, we will try to put out like a response sheet through your registration information. Can someone comment? I have a question here from Harold. Could one of you comment on the dynamics of the AAPI communities feeling able to gain political power and representation in our communities? It took years for the Chinese American community in San Francisco to gain representation in the San Francisco city politics, and likewise the Vietnamese community in Orange County and the Cambodians in Long Beach still lack the political representation that they deserve. Melissa, maybe you can address this one? You have some experience in this.
Yeah, and you know, it's a struggle. There's I honestly never thought I'd become an elected official. And I think when I was starting to see that the people who were making decisions for my community, for the API community, did not look like me, that's the time I took a stand. That's when I knew I needed to take a stand. You know, even working in government, you know, we need more people who are API to represent our values, the issues that we should be advocating for. And it's true, like what Harold said, in Long Beach, just now we're having people have tried to run before, but now we're at a time where we can essentially do it. It's just a matter of people stepping up. And there's a history of APIs who just want to be behind the scenes, but people overthink it, you know, they don't want to be the face. And you know, it's so important to be that face, because who else is going to speak for our issues? And so for me, like with the Filipino American community, Los Angeles County is the largest Filipino American population outside of the Philippines, but yet I'm the only Filipina American Democrat. And so, you know, our time is here. It's just a matter of people stepping up, and anyone who wants to run, call me. That's the bottom line. I will help. And we need more people to step up like Jasmine. So.
Thank you, Melissa. Adrian, you actually wrote about this in your book a little bit. Can you comment on some of the reasons why AAPI members may not run for office as frequently, or is that a misconception? Do they run just as frequently? What are impediments to accessing the levers of political power for the AAPI community?
Well, I don't know if I'm the most qualified person to answer, but I mean, as far as the forces inside of ourselves, I do think that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of self-doubt we have in ourselves from our history, and there's a lot of you know, anytime you have minority communities that are, you know, I mean, I'm not going to say, so there have been, you know, Asians in this country for a long time, right? But they're still developing identity and community and body of resources and support. So I think that when you have that, it's tough because you have fewer resources to draw upon. Sometimes you have fewer examples of success and a lot of pressure to try to represent well, because there aren't as many opportunities. Sometimes, I think there's a quote in my book that says about Constance Wu said that, when she was trying to, be in Hollywood, trying out for a role, it's almost like you're someone trying out for the Olympics, because it's like, every 4 years, because it's just so much competition. It's so difficult and fewer people. So, I mean, some of those forces impact it, but that's what I've seen.
Also, in addition, like growing up, I never really saw Asian women in Congress make the front pages of anything. So I think as a result, it makes me less inclined to actually go for that role. But now we have people, so.
You have Melissa right here as a role model for you, Jasmine. Thank you guys so much. By the way, I love Constance Wu. I just have to add that. I love that show, Fresh Off the Boat. I'd like to read this one aloud because it kind of speaks to what we're talking about, allyship and reaching across identities. Are any of you aware of data specific to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander bullying? I'm concerned that including the NHPI community would only minimize the issue, and I'm not aware of specific bullying within the NPHI community. However, and this is a statement I really wanted to read to you all here today. However, we stand united in resolving this horrific issue. This is from Victor C. Thompson of the National Pacific Islander Education Network. And Victor, I first want to thank you so much for being here with us and for standing in solidarity and for reaching across to make connections. Stuart, would you know if there's any data specific to Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community facing harassment?
I haven't heard any specific cases, but I wouldn't be surprised that they have the same kind of bullying that Asian Americans face. The data that I have seen more recently on Pacific Islanders is how Pacific Islanders have the highest mortality rate from the COVID-19 coronavirus. And so that is a statistic that I've seen over and over again. And some of the Pacific Islander leaders have reached out to us to highlight that disparity, and we do. But it is a very alarming statistic that I've seen over and over in the recent months.
And that could be a program in and of itself, disparities in healthcare, which are really rising to the forefront of our attention during the COVID-19 pandemic. The disparities, of course, have always been there, with certain communities being more impacted but more visible now. And I hope we can talk about that sometime. Amelia, I'm gonna ask you now, we have really great questions in here. I know you have a closing statement to make. I can let you do the closing and then we can continue for whoever wants to hang around to address the rest of the questions. Shall we do that? Okay, please go ahead.
Okay. I mean, what can I say that hasn't been said? But first and foremost, just thank you so much to our panelists, to Stuart and Adrian and Jasmine and to Melissa for being vulnerable and for sharing your experiences and really just allowing us. One of the things that I took notes as I was listening to this, and one of the words that came up was constantly, to humanize, right? To humanize something and the importance of that. I think all of us can resonate with so many things that you've said in terms of feeling dehumanized at times in our lives because of who we are, what we do, or what we look like. But as an interfaith council, again, our goal, our purpose is really to do just that, to humanize people, whether it's people of different faiths or cultures, or it's people or things that we hear or things that we see, like the statistics that Stuart shared. We can't just read that over 2,000 people, 2,000, Asian American and Pacific Islander neighbors of ours have been discriminated against and just go on living a normal day, right? Because it hurts. And we saw that Jasmine's experience, Melissa's experience, it hurts. Xenophobia hurts, racism hurts, it dehumanizes. And it's our role to really create a counter narrative to that. And again, you know, just some of the notes I took, and I want to end with this. People were saying, you know, how for us as an interfaith council, you know, we pride ourselves that we're guided by our faith precepts or our moral compass to really rectify or to help to rectify the wrongs in the society. And, you know, these 7 pointers, shield one another, we must be the shield for others in pain. So true. You know, faith begins with humility. We have to be cognizant and recognize that we can't do everything on our own. Absolutely. We have to take a deeper dive and see into the into the lenses of the other people. It's so true. We have to be willing to listen. I mean, that's just, I mean, imperative. You know, and what Stuart said again, you know, there's this urgency for us to for help from those around us, and we need to be there to help. And I think the biggest thing that, you know, took from this, one of the biggest things is, you know, change happens with us. And I think today we learned that, and how we have to be, you know, that change that we want to see. And it's so important. So I thank you all. And Sarah, I thank you for leading this discussion and facilitating this really important conversation, for all the work that you put into this as well. So thank you all so much. And for all our audience members, thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'm gonna, you know, I would, as an executive director, it's incumbent upon me to remind everyone, if you're possible, to please, you know, continue supporting our council, to make those donations if you're able to. And yes, Cheryl, my amazing office administrator, there you go. 3 ways that you can do so. Again, just a reminder, and then also a reminder to join us for the gala, to where we can celebrate one another. We would love to have you join us for that as well. And, you know, and I think as I was writing this, I think about my little daughter who's 19 months old, and I was listening to everyone, and Jasmine, I want to say that I look forward to voting for you for president one day, so that my little daughter can look up to you, because that's the way change happens. I want her to see that, you know what, we don't all look the same, and we can be amazing people following the footsteps of Melissa and all these amazing individuals. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And please, Sarah, if you want to continue with the questions, that would be great.
Thank you. And we will be posting this video in 2 parts on YouTube, so you guys can go back and watch it and share it with your friends. I'm going to ask the panelists to be mindful of their chat, because there might be some questions that are specific, and I'd like you to screen them before I share them. I have a question here that was for Adrian specifically. As a professional working in the area of diversity consulting, what do you think of D'Angelo's book, White Fragility?
Oh, okay. I'll make it kind of quick. So, you know, I think that it's definitely a popular book. You know, it's been really skyrocketed in popularity in recent events as well. Personally, for me, I guess it's just my approach. My leadership approach isn't exactly centered on addressing, changing people who are the most resistant. So like people who are fragile, white people who are fragile. I tend to focus on people who are open and, you know, kind of looking to make a change, because often you try to convince the people who are the most resistant, and we all know you can't. It's really hard to change people who are like that, you know. And so I think that's probably why I don't necessarily go that approach. But I think that it could, you know, the tool could be a helpful. It's definitely there's a book, and then there's the term, which has kind of taken on a life of its own, where I think some people really do focus a lot on you know, pointing out the flaws that white people have. Now, I think that, you know, it can be used well, and it can be used constructively or not, depending on how it's being done. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of my experience with it.
I personally think that anti-racism, like anti-racist education, is super crucial. Like at my internship this summer, I started a book club with my team, and everyone's white except me and this other woman. And it's been like really eye-opening, because the entire time my like manager and other people on the team are just saying, I'm so shocked. I can't believe this. And like for me, like I'm not shocked, because, you know, I've been reading these articles, but at the same time, I think it is important for white people to reflect. And there are ways to be constructive, but also I think we do have to like put those conversations at the forefront, because if the majority of people are not going to learn and are not willing to learn, then like we got to start the conversations, like either at work or at church. Like in my ministry, I'm the first advocacy and activism lead, and it's really so that people can find their roles in this movement. Like we're not forcing anyone to say Black Lives Matter, you know, but more so it's just to give them that opportunity to learn.
Thank you. I'm going to read a difficult question now, and I invite everyone to consider it and answer as they feel comfortable. Although I have one person in mind for it. So somebody has written that they agree that within the AAPI community, like many other communities, there's anti-Black bias. And we see that bias perhaps, or this comment then says, was this bias increased when Blacks struck at Asian shops in response to the attitude against Blacks? So I think this person is asking us to address, and I'm going to ask Melissa, as a city councilwoman, have you seen a spike in, is there an epidemic of African Americans attacking AAPI-owned shops?
That's tough. I've had friends who had businesses that were looted, and it was not only by African American, it was a lot of people who took advantage of that vulnerability during the movement. What I can say, what I've noticed even for my city, we unfortunately had people who were reporting kids who were walking down the neighborhoods, reporting to the police and calling them to come just because they were simply walking. And this was like days after the George Floyd murder. And we were starting to see the protests rising around in the city and surrounding cities. And they called on them when they weren't even going to go protest, they just wanted to play. So I was so angry when I saw that. And I even had the conversations with my sheriffs, like it's like, how, why, you know? They were just kids with their backpacks walking. And I even saw within our business owners in our downtown that were suddenly putting up boards and you know, trying to protect their businesses because they thought they were going to be rioted, and then money being asked to for more extra law enforcement. When I said, I was just blown away and angry. Like, you're already simply thinking that this is going to happen, you know, but it did it, you know, and I don't know if it's more prominent now, but those are experiences that have happened since.
Stuart, you were engaged during the LA riots, and I know there's some history there too with AAPI shopkeepers and the unrest after in that time period. Could you perhaps also offer some insight from that perspective and what you've seen and how you understood it?
Well, I do think that there was some targeting of Asian shops, but the overriding thing that happened during the LA civil unrest in 1992 was the acquittal of the 4 officers in the Rodney King beating. So it was really the police brutality that sparked the rioting. And the rioting turned from some targeting of Asian businesses into a food for all, so that people were just trying to grab. It didn't matter if you were an Asian shop or white shop or black shop, you would get looted. There was really no differentiation after a day or two. So I think that fundamentally it was the police brutality that sparked the protest in that time period. But I do think that some Asians did feel that they were getting targeted. And there were over 2,500 Asian shops that were destroyed or damaged. So I think there has to be a discussion. In fact, there were some Korean Americans who worked for us during the May and June this year, whose parents still remembered the rioting. And so in the course of the Black Lives Matter movement, they've had to have an honest discussion with their parents about what really happened and how to look at that. So I think that education and dialogue is very necessary. So I was talking about when groups come together, you need to have an action plan, whether it's on affirmative action or police brutality or anti-Asian violence, but there also has to be room for healing and discussion and dialogue. And so I think that is where that should take place.
And it's interesting how we assign blame, right? In that moment, if your shop has been struck, you need someone to be angry with. And it seems easier to blame an individual than the system that is maintaining the inequities in our society. And we really need to talk more about the systemic inequities, the systemic injustice and systemic racism that's present, and the biases that, and studying, and as Jasmine mentioned, the book clubs that really unpack and help us all understand our implicit biases better, I think are going to be necessary for us to be able to begin to understand systemic racism. Let's see, I'm just scrolling through the questions here. I think this has been partially answered. I don't know if somebody wants to add to it. What would you encourage each of us to do to be engaged, to contribute to the effort of bridging divides and striving for social and economic justice? Okay, here's the more specific question. What organizations do you think are most effective and need our support? Any thoughts on that?
I think part of it is doing the research and finding out what you're passionate about. And yeah, like I don't know if I have like specific orgs to recommend, but I think it's just important to like continue to educate yourself, right? Like even if you have a PhD and a master's, it doesn't mean that you're going to stop learning, right? It's always important to continue talking to people, having these discussions, not shying away from them. And yeah.
Thank you, Jasmine.
I would agree. And, I'm not going to, maybe I'll state the ones that the panelists can't say, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the South Coast Interfaith Council, maybe it goes without saying. But I would say, the most important organization to support would be, the one that's where you are, so whether it's your church, your synagogue, your mosque, or your business, this is what's so unique about this time right now is that it feels like everybody is taking a look at themselves and saying, what can we do? What should we do about this? Some of them are doing it for good reasons. Some of them are doing it because they feel pressure, or guilt alleviation, right? But regardless of the reason, they're actually asking those questions. And so I think that it's not unusual to bring up that topic with your company or with your, church or whatever it is. You could bring that up and people wouldn't really wouldn't bat an eye. They would understand why you're asking that question. So I would start where you are, and really help them to connect them, to resources and to diagnose the issue. One thing that I think that a lot of times we do is we want to go to solutions, but we have to figure out what really is the problem and what is the cause of that issue, and so if it is a training, that's great. But for some groups, maybe it's not a training. Maybe it's something that's deeper, that you have to really evaluate the policies or the structures of the organization. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Adrian. And this is a specific question for Stuart that also has to do with organizations. Stuart, the question is, are you working with the JACC? It's a specific question.
I'm sorry, the JCCC?
It says JACC.
We have worked with I don't know if that's the same group, but the Japanese American Community and Cultural Council Center. We've worked with them in the past. In fact, their former board was our board chair as well, Sandy Sakamoto. So we've worked with them very closely in the past. It's a very good group in the Little Tokyo community in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Stuart. This is a great question that kind of builds on what Jasmine shared earlier. So somebody has written here, I'm appreciating Jasmine's comment about Gen Z and their commitment to engage with corporations who are socially responsible and progressive. Couldn't that extend to those of us who are investors, i.e. through our retirement funds, to be vigilant and active in our research and decisions about where our financial resources go? That is a great comment. Does anyone want to add anything to that? It's kind of a well-constructed thought.
Well, I'm speaking to a group at Microsoft in a few weeks. So if you have any comments, let me know.
What group? Is it the Criminal Justice Reform Initiative?
I think Stuart missed your question. Jasmine, you want to repeat
Stuart,
that?
what group is it?
Oh, this is the Microsoft employees. I'm not exactly sure if it's a specific group, but occasionally they bring in outside speakers to speak to the employees. So I get asked a few times a week to speak to different groups. So this is one of them. I'm also speaking to a multiracial group of the Chambers of Commerce's Asian, Black, and Latino tomorrow, actually. So these discussions like today are very helpful.
Well, thank you guys so much. Thank you all of our panelists today for, again, being here with us and staying to answer the questions. I think we've addressed all the questions that arrived through the Q&A. Let me just make sure I have nothing else. Yep, that's the last question. Thank you guys so much for being here with us. We will be editing and compiling this conversation into 2 segments and then posting it on our YouTube channel and our social media. We will share it with everyone and invite you to share it with your family and friends and communities. Thank you so much. Have a truly blessed day and week. And may we all be agents of change to bring about justice and compassion equitably for all human beings in every space that we occupy. Have a great day. Thank you.